Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Aristotle webinar where today we're going to be looking at this topic of shadow data and how organizations can control it and manage it. It sounds like a scary term, but it's actually not, and it's really good for us to give something that we all know about and something that we all think about a term. And that's what today's topic is really about, is understanding our data risks in our organization and how we can control it, how we can manage it, and how we can make it a little bit more accessible to users. So today, what we're going to be looking through is a number of topics, more broadly from a data management perspective, and then also looking at ways that the Aristotle Metadata Registry can support this. So if you're not a client yet, you're still going to get a lot of value out of this webinar. But if you are a client, there's things that you can pick up and new features that we've been developing that will support this. So what we're going to talk through is, what is this idea of shadow data and why is it a problem and how can we change the attitude to it? Where it exists and how it kind of exists, and what you can do, what tangible steps you can do today to start solving that problem. Because a lot of what we talk about with Aristotle metadata and our processes is how can we get users starting to solve this problem quickly so we can achieve those quick wins. But first, I want to talk about this idea of shadow data, and it's actually not a new term. It's not a term that we've created. There are some really good articles out there that I'd suggest you look up and share with your audience, because it talks about this idea of data that's ungoverned and data that's unmanaged. So very similar to the concept of shadow IT, where people bring in systems or sign up for cloud services, as we do quite often, shadow data is data that exists outside of our formal processes. It's not necessarily a problem that this is happening. The problem is when we don't know that it exists. So the challenge we've got is, we know that organizations have this problem where they need to start, producing reports. People kind of open up the systems and the tools that are in front of them, and they start developing, new and powerful analytics, but aren't telling other people where they exist. So we've got data that's undocumented. It's really valuable for the organization, but it's not being managed, so nobody knows where it's being controlled. And what does it look like? Well, what it looks like is actually really straightforward, and you've probably come across it quite a lot. So before we talk about what shadow data is, I want to talk about what it isn't. What it isn't is it isn't things like our data warehouses or pipelines or dashboards. Those are all generally well governed. We know what those are. We know where our data warehouse is. We know what's in there usually, and we know how our data pipelines move around. So that's the stuff that exists above the waterline. And I like to use this metaphor of an iceberg to say, the most dangerous thing of an iceberg isn't what we can see, it's what's hidden beneath the surface. And the same goes for our data. So our data warehouses, when we know about them, they're visible. They're above the waterline. We know where they are. We know how to dodge and avoid them. The challenge is when we start thinking about things below the waterline in the murky depths of our data where we don't know what they are. It's all the things hidden in our data lakes that we can't quite find and control. And these are things that are probably quite common that you see in your organization. So one of the best examples is things like our legacy databases. So we know that a lot of organizations will maintain and continue the use of systems long after their initial lifespan. So we know that they're still around, but they haven't been able to be moved into our data warehouse yet. And that's a real issue, is we still know that this is an important asset. We know that it's got a lot of important data in it. But the question is, do other people know that it's still around? We go through these big data transformations and information's still left in their existing systems. Do users know where to go and where to find information if they want to go back to the source? Other examples are things like our finance and HR systems. And this is one that I love to use as an example when we talk with people who say they don't have data. A lot of people, when we first meet with them and start talking about their data landscapes, they say, we don't have data in our organizations. And the reality is every organization has data, even if they don't know about it, even if they don't think of it in that way, because we have staff data and we have HR data and we have invoicing and payment data. This is information that exists and it's really important. The reason why it's really important to manage as well is that our staff data may actually exist in some of our legacy information as well. Our business information around what's being done needs to align with our staff information about who works for our organization, and it needs to align with our suppliers and our finances to make sure we're paying the right people for business activities that are being done. So making sure that our data governance includes finance is a really big, important part of the process. We have externally sourced data. And again, one of those areas where people think about, we're not a data organization, but they are, because they're bringing information in. Anytime we buy data or anytime we source data from open systems or open registries, anytime we incorporate data from organizations like the Australian Bureau of Statistics to bring into our organization as part of like an augmentation process, needs to be documented. Because that data especially, it's not created here, but people need to know where the source is. If you've bought data, you need to know where to go to get a new subscription to it. If you're downloading data from an open registry, do people know where to go to check the source of that information? Again, these are examples where people will download it, put it on a share drive, and not think to manage it and tell other people what's available. Again, just from a pure finance perspective, you don't want multiple parts of your organization buying the same asset more than once if you've already brought it in. So making sure people know what external data you're using is just as important as the data you create yourself. And then the last two that we've got are the dreaded Excel spreadsheets and our Access databases. Very common for organizations to still have, systems that are run through Excel. And that's because it's the most used Office application in the world. If you're thinking data, most people's default position is to open an Excel spreadsheet. You grab some data from one of your external sources, you get an extract from your HR system, you pull it together with some data from one of your legacy systems, and you produce some new analytics. That's just the way that business operates. And we don't want to change that. It's actually very hard to change that process because it's a tool that's right there on your laptop right now. So what we need to do is get people to talk about where it is. If we've got important information that's being managed or controlled in an Access database or an Excel spreadsheet, just capturing it and recording it is just as important as knowing that the data exists. So now that we know what shadow data is, I want to talk about why that's risky. So we've got all of this data that exists below the waterline. Again, it's the bottom half of the iceberg. It's the bit that's most dangerous. It's the bit we can't see. And that's exactly why we have a challenge with it. Like, we don't know that it's there. As I said, like, if you're buying data in from a third party, you don't want to be repurchasing that. You've got this risk of reusing or repurchasing data and wasting resources. It also means it's really difficult to find. Again, a lot of the data we're talking about comes from systems that can't be migrated into our data warehouse. Our data warehouse isn't a HR system, but a HR system still has data in it. So what do we do to make sure that people know where to go to find the right information? All the systems we've talked about need to exist separately. Do we have a single place where we can go to look up to find all of this data? And it's also difficult to know who has the right to access it because we're not recording what that information is. We need to know who's responsible for capturing this data, who's responsible for using this data, where's it being maintained? These are all questions that need to be answered as part of that process. Like, where are we talking about who has the right to that data? And one of the biggest ones, and this kind of comes to why we've talked about this shadow data problem, is a lot of data has value from the use that we can generate from it. The big things that we're talking about now, automation, we're talking about being able to produce new AI models and machine learning models, or new visualizations or new reports. How do we add value to data? And the question we have to ask ourselves is, if nobody knows that that data exists, if nobody's talking about it, if nobody knows how to find it, how can we automate it? You can't automate the existence of data if you don't know that the data exists in the first place. So that act of documentation is what unlocks the ability for us to do those automations down the track. So it's a really big risk because we've got data that we potentially are spending more resources on than we need to. People don't know who's accessing it, and we're not getting the maximum value out of it. So it's a really big risk for the organization. And the reason that this happens is for a couple of different kind of business activity reasons. So as I said, generally people are trying to do their job the best they can. And again, somebody who's opening up Excel to produce a new report rapidly is doing the right thing. They're producing new value for the organization. The problem is that that activity, that business activity, isn't thought of as a data activity. Somebody who's producing a report for, a staff headcount or staff changes over time, who's doing an extract from a HR system and building a report in Excel, they're not thinking about it from a data perspective. They're thinking of it from a, am I getting my work done perspective? So their job is producing a report for somebody that they're working with, not doing their data documentation. So we've got to change that mentality. We've got to change that mindset because, again, if somebody doesn't know that part of their role is good documentation, they're going to continue doing the exact same thing they've done before. So we need to make sure that the requirements for documentation are clear and consistent. We need to tell people, if you first of all, what is data in our organization, and are you recording it in the right way so that people know what you've done? And is that accessible in a central place? The other one is that it's just not prioritized. So we're not actually telling people that this is part of the role. Like we tell people, you have to show up to work, you have to do certain things, make sure you clock on, you swipe your card. We're not telling people as part of your role, if you're producing data, every time you open an Excel spreadsheet or every time you make a new Access database or every time you purchase data, you need to tell somebody where you did it and how you did it. And it's that prioritization that's really key because it's not actually a big task. And we'll look at that in a second, but it's not a big effort to actually make those changes. So what we want to do is make sure that people know that they need to do this task. And then lastly, we want to make sure that people know that we need to know about their data. When we've got people who are maintaining these legacy systems where we've gone through a massive transformation process and they're still responsible for a little Access database that's driving half of our reports out of an organization, we need to bring them on the journey. We don't lock them out and say, well, you're using Access, you're not part of the transformation process. You're using an Access system and we don't want to know about it because it's going to make the rest of the project look bad. We need to make sure every single data project is prioritized and everybody knows that good documentation is what makes good quality data so that they know that they shouldn't be ashamed or they shouldn't be, thinking that their data is not valuable because all data has risk and value for the organization. So getting everybody across the organization to know that documentation is a priority and we need to do it well and we need to centralize it so people can find it is really the key. The other thing that we need to do is tell them, what we want them to do. And that's what we've got here. So today, what we're going to look at is two things. We're going to look at how we can shine a light on this immediately. There's actually a couple of really easy things that we can do to get people thinking about how they can document their data. And it doesn't require, a change in process. It doesn't require them to have to bring in a system like Aristotle, which supports a lot of those activities. But there's little things we can do today to get people starting to think in that mentality. The first one is everybody just needs to write down what they're doing. Every time that you create a new data asset, make sure you tell people if you're keeping it, if it's not just being created and then immediately deleted, if you're keeping it somewhere, let people know, and don't require massive amounts of information because the more burden we put on people, the easier it is for them to deprioritize it. One of the things that we've done at Aristotle is we've developed what we call the MAST methodology. And we've talked about this quite a lot, and it's a way to help users engage with these processes in a quick and iterative way. And what we tell people is every data asset across your organization really only needs four things. We need a name, so we know what people are calling it. We need a description, like a really nice textual description of what that data means. We need to know where it is so we can find it if it's the right data for us. And we need to know who to talk to. How do we get more information about it if I need it? And oftentimes that 4 pieces of information about an asset is both really easy to collect, it's really quick to collect, and it's really valuable. It actually offers quite a high value for organizations. So we don't need to go down the full path of documenting everything. Sometimes a starting point of just 4 pieces of information about an asset is a place for us to start. When we see more value from that data, then we can prioritize additional documentation. And it's this consistency that means that we know, that everybody's collecting information in the same way. One of the other things we can look at is bringing that information into a central register. So what can we do to make sure that people can find it is put it into a place where people can see it. Now, often that's challenging without a system that's dedicated to management of data resources like the Aristotle Metadata Registry, but even an Excel spreadsheet that all users can kind of maintain is a good starting point because we know then that people are controlling, they're adding to it. And that's one of the other things, is making sure that there's a collaborative review process, getting people to come back and add to it over time. Sure, we may want to get more information about each asset, throughout the life of a project, but at that starting point, can we get a little bit? And can we get you to come back in a few weeks' time and add a little bit more? And then can we get you to come back and do a little bit more as well? And it's all of these things working together. The idea of, giving users a simple starting guide, making sure it's consistent, making sure it's centralized, and building that collaborative approach, that's key to getting really, really good data documentation. So the next bit is going to be looking at Aristotle while the Q&A comes in. The next bit is going to be looking at ways that we can use the Aristotle Metadata Registry to control this. Because again, it's not about automation. It's not about, trying to scan things. It's about going to users and saying, what can I get you to do really, really quickly to get you involved in this process? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to switch my screen. So bear with me a second. And I'm going to bring up my registry that I prepared and am still logged into. There we go. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share my screen. Go. And I've shared my screen. Perfect. So everybody should now see, I'm just going to jump back into my dashboard. So this is what basic users will see when they come to their Aristotle registry to start documenting this information. And the idea is we want to make it as simple and as easy as possible for users to engage with this process. And that's why we've got this really big option to just create content, create metadata. And one of the recent additions that we've added that you can see up the top is we've actually started to add ways for administrators to control what users actually see as a first step. So we've created these metadata templates that people can use to follow to start documenting this information. So the idea is if I have really consistent terminology, so for example, the Office of the National Data Commissioner, we did a webinar on that a month or two ago. We can actually capture, these really nice forms that are guided and directed to help users get in there. One of the things that I want to look at, though, is I've created a really simple data asset form over here on the right that's designed for users who are only engaging at that first stage, people who don't know what data they've got access to and want to control that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through 3 stages following this. We're going to go in and we're going to create a data asset. We're going to review that. We're going to open a review so I can share it with my data governance team to understand, what data I've found or what data I want to document. And then we're going to look at ways that Aristotle actually supports automation through some of our automated checks to help users understand what they can do to document their data better. So as part of this process, I'm just going to jump in and I'm going to click create. And I get given an Aristotle screen that's a little bit cut down from our usual one, where I can start putting my data in. And the data that I want to talk about today is actually the data that we're all kind of involved in, and that's our webinar information. So we actually collect data about our webinars to understand, how often people come along, how often do we run them, what days are the most likely to get people to attend, so that we can deliver better webinars in future. So we capture this information so that we can, use it for better purposes down the track. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy in some of this information. So this is one that I've kind of prepared earlier. So I'm just going to drop in my name, my 2024 webinar attendance data, and I'm going to drop in a little description here. So my description is just going to describe, it's going to talk about what data I have. So this is data that tracks registration and attendance to our webinars so that we can understand what the most popular topics are, who's most likely to attend from kind of which sectors, and what topics we might want to present in future. So the idea is that we can, use this to better tailor our services, to you who are coming along. So this is my starting point. I've got a little bit of information here, and notice that none of this is really technical. It's really descriptive. It's talking about what is this data, why did I collect it, and how can it be used? So I'm starting to get a really rich understanding of what this asset is, even before I've seen it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, as the person who delivers these webinars, I'm just going to go in and say the contact point is me. The person, if you want more information about this asset, then I'm probably the person that you'll need to talk to. Over time, I might add some more information in here, but for now, I want to just start with, I'm going to keep it really simple. If you want me to provide some more information about this asset, email me and I'll have a conversation with you. And then lastly, I want to talk about where this data is. So we've got this origin that we've set up. So an origin field is where the data has come from. And I've just put in like a basic description. So we have a SharePoint, like most companies out there. We have a SharePoint drive that we use to put information in. And notice that I'm not giving you access. I'm not showing you the data. I'm just talking about how to get it. So somebody inside our organization knows where this is. They know how to access it if they have permissions. So they know exactly where this data is stored and available. And that's really all I've got here. So we've cut down the interface, or we've provided a customized interface so we can set up a really simple documentation process. And that took about 2 minutes. It didn't take very long for us to type that out. Now, I would have typed it out, but as you know, if you're trying to do a presentation and type at the same time, it never goes well. But the idea is that a user can type out that information and they can start talking about what data they have. Once I save this, and I'm also going to add it into one of my data governance work groups. So I've added it to a team so that other people can be involved. So just there, the other thing that I added to make the next step work is I've added it to a team who's going to be involved in my review. So other people now have some access to this. So if I create this item, what I'm going to see is I'm going to see a cut down version of this data asset. So I've got my definition, my contact point, my location, and my name. I've also added in a little bit of help text here. So when a user sees an asset that's been documented using this simplified view, it talks about why some of those fields don't exist. So we can now start tailoring this to particular users at particular points in time. So they've created this, and now it's starting to kind of get users understanding what they can do to document more information. So that's creating content through the Aristotle registry. So now what I've done here is I've documented an asset. I know people in my team can look at it. And now I want to start going through that collaborative process of getting my data governance team involved. So what we've tried to do through the MAST methodology is separate out how users can kind of interact in different ways. So we have business users documenting the assets they own and sharing that documentation with data governance areas who can help them, improve that documentation over time. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to open a review. So here under one of my actions, I have the option to submit it for review. When I submit it for review, it gives me the option to select who I want to review this content and what I want them to do with the process. So I'm going to add my team again. And I'm going to select my data governance area. I want the data governance area in my organization to review my data set. And I'm just going to drop the name in again. So I'm going to drop my name in. So this is a review of the 2024 webinar attendance data for getting it ready for documentation. I'd like it to be recorded at least. So I want to understand, what the stages are that are available for my registration authority. So this is, again, part of that governance process. Is it made available to public users or internal users? How do I want to make it available? I'm just going to leave my single item in there. So I'm just getting my data asset reviewed. I haven't done any more work. I don't want to do anything else with it. And then I'm going to submit that in for review. So I'm going to create a new review, and this is going to start notifying people across my organization of activities that are happening in the system. So I've opened this up, and I've basically just sent off notifications to my data governance team and my data governance, my team and the registration authority, who's going to endorse this content. I've sent them some notifications through email and through our notification system in Aristotle and said, hey, a new data asset's been documented. Somebody needs to kind of look at it and review it. And that's what this section down the bottom is doing. So here we can see what a data governance team would see. They can actually start to engage with that process automatically. And that's basically stage 2. So stage 2 is now building that collaboration process out. So it's not just about putting content in, it's about building that collaboration process out. And then the third thing I want to look at really quickly before we kind of close out this session, just looking at ways that we can kind of raise the profile of this data, is that validation process. What can we do to help users understand what they need to fill in? So to do this, first of all, one of the things I want to cover is a lot of validation for documentation it's not an automation process. It's a human process. It's a review process. It's a peer review process of somebody going in and asking questions about, whether or not it meets a business need. And often that's a very subjective process. Are things completed? Are timelines being met? Is the right information being made available? But there are checks that we can do through Aristotle. And I'm not going to show you how to write those because, again, it's a really short webinar. But what I can do is I can actually go to this validation section as part of my review and proactively check whether or not everything's been completed. When I go here, what I can see is I can see that information or these rules are starting to apply to me. So I can see that two basic checks have been applied. First of all, my name may not be accurate. So we've got a rule that's been set up that says all names have to start with a capital letter. And obviously this doesn't check for numbers. So I've got an error there that either means that my rule is incorrect or my data is incorrect. Maybe I need to go back and change the name. And it's also verified that my definition isn't empty. So the right information is being made available as well. So I haven't left it blank. I haven't left it empty so that nobody knows what's there. So it's starting to check through some of those fields for me to make sure the right information is available. Now, if you want to know more about how to create these rules, we've actually got some really good help documentation up on our community and on our help documentation site at help.aristotlemetadata.com with links down here. So if you're on your Aristotle registry, you can click on help and it'll guide you through to our knowledge base as well. But ultimately, that's kind of the end of the process here is this has started my journey. It's not completed my journey, but it's started the process of things that I want to look at. So in a really quick, time frame, in 10 minutes, what I've been able to do is I've been able to go into my registry. I've created the beginning of documentation for an asset that is still quite valuable. So I know what that asset is. I know where it's stored. I know who's responsible for it, and I know how I can use it. So again, I've already, conquered a large part of that problem with shadow data. I've opened a review so I can get other parts of my organization involved because, again, we want to turn this into a team sport. We want business areas starting the process and our governance areas helping them start that journey or continue that journey for documentation. And the other thing that we've already done is we've shown here as part of these validations, things that we can do to help those governance areas start to automate some of that process. So some of those processes where we can go, hey, a user hasn't completed all the necessary fields, we can start to do those checks as well so that users can proactively kind of fill in content that's necessary as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. So bear with me while there we go. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there because I think that's kind of run through everything that we wanted to run through today. What I will do though is I might bring back our closing out slide before we go to Q&A. I'll leave that slide for after. So basically that's the end of our webinar. So we've talked through shadow data as a problem around communication. So it comes when people don't talk about what their data is. It's not something that can be immediately solved through automation, but doing that documentation will help users solve that problem eventually over time. Once we know about it, once it's been documented, then we can start to do those high value tasks. And then the last thing that we looked at the end is those 3 stages that we can start all users on through the Aristotle registry. So if you're already a user of Aristotle, the things that you can do there is you can start to run users through the challenge of how do we, get users telling us about their data? How do we get them, informing us that those activities are happening? And how do we support them with some of those automated checks to make sure that those processes are continuing to happen over time. So hopefully everybody found that valuable. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually looking past a little ring light. I'm going to bring up our Q&A. So if there are any questions, please pop them in the Q&A now. I'll be staying around for the next 10 minutes, answering any questions you've got. Otherwise, if no questions come through, the recording will be made available shortly so that you can share this with colleagues and we'll be putting it on some of our social media channels as well. So thank you very much. And I'm going to open it up for Q&A. We've already got a couple of questions coming through our Q&A right now. So a couple of comments here. So one that came through from one of the people was talking about documentation requiring ongoing curation. So what components can be used to manage this? So that's a really good question. I'm not going to use your name because we'll talk about this on YouTube. So part of the process there is providing reminders through the system. So we have a lot of reminders and notifications through the system and reports that users can develop to help them know about, I guess for lack of a better term, stale assets, things that haven't been talked about or documented for quite some time. And again, like it's one of those processes where an automated system may, be continually generating data, but if nobody's using it or if it's not being used for any inputs, there's a very subjective process that comes into that. So that's where documentation really supports that automation process as well. So through the system, we can do those reports, and we can do those reminders and notifications to help users find assets that haven't been talked about or haven't been used in some time. There was another question here from somebody about being able to see all of the assets that are created. So the answer is yes. There's a lot of different ways through the system. We actually have done some previous webinars. So what we might do as part of the wrap up for this is we might send some links to some webinars we did on data inventorying. So we did some tools for developing really nice lists for users to engage with. We also have a really good search process as well. So, and again, that's why documentation is important, is we can put in all of that context, all of that text that makes search really usable. So we can start to find things based on how people have talked about data as well. So it's not just about numbers, it's what do we talk about when we talk about our data. So there's a really big component in there around search. So yes, that is something we do support, and also something that users should look for in any system that they're using. Any part of the process requires users to talk about all the different ways that they use data and the ways that they collect data. So those are all the questions that are happening in our Q&A so far. Are there any other final questions on shadow data or challenges with data documentation or ways that Aristotle can support that? If there's any questions, feel free to pop those in the chat. And I haven't done a thumbs up for a while. So I can see there's a hand up. If you just want to pop that in the chat, I can answer it there as well. Unfortunately, because this is set up as a webinar, we've got people on mute. But if there's any questions, just drop them in the chat and I'll respond to them there. Number one, hands up, number one. And while we're waiting for any questions to come through, throw me a thumbs up if you found this valuable, if you found the idea of shadow data useful, because we will be incorporating this in some of our future communications as well. So we'll be telling users about this as a problem they need to look into as well. So thank you very much. Cool, that's good. Oh, always worry. Okay, so I think we haven't got any more questions coming through the Q&A. In that case, I'm going to give it about another 30 seconds. If you have any other questions, pop them in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll wrap this up. As I said, we do actually record these. We'll make this available through our YouTube channel and through our social media as well. So we'll make sure that users have access to this, because again, part of the challenge is sharing it with people in our organizations to help them be aware of what their roles are. So I'm going to wait. If you quickly pop one in the chat right now, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I think we're done for the day. Okie dokie. In that case, we've got one hand up, but I think nobody's popping anything in the chat. In that case, what I'll do is we'll start signing off. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Thank you for coming along. We will be doing a couple more of these over the next couple of months. Just by way of upcoming topics, we've got a couple of really interesting ones to talk through. So we're going to be releasing a new training portal. We'll be talking about it at a future webinar. We'll be talking about our upcoming two new products that will be coming out. So we've got the Aristotle Activate, which is a data scanning tool that we've been talking for a while. And we've also got the Aristotle App Store that will be coming out soon for users who want to develop stuff. I'm checking. I just had somebody who I've answered all those questions. So I had somebody like showing me a laptop. So we've gone through all the questions in the Q&A around documentation and around search from users. So otherwise, I guess in that case, thank you very much for attending. Hopefully we will see you soon. One last question was, how is Metadata New South Wales going? It seems to be going really well. We have a couple of new departments who will be joining Metadata.New South Wales in the next couple of months. So watch this space for new announcements coming out there. So thank you very much for asking that question. But for those of you who don't know, metadata.newsouthwales.gov.au is an excellent example of users who are documenting this information so that people know what data is happening across the entire New South Wales public sector. I think it's a fantastic initiative. And if you haven't seen it, you should probably check it out. But thank you very much for that plug from somebody who totally wasn't an Aristotle plant. But thank you very much. And we'll close the webinar and we'll see everybody at the next one later in October. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.